There is an unwritten rule in professional sports that is held for over a century. The league is bigger than the player. Always. The commissioner holds the gavel. The shield protects itself. And any individual who gets too big, too loud, or too powerful gets reminded of that fact very quickly. It has happened to the greatest names in basketball history. It has happened to icons, legends, and generational talents who thought they were untouchable. The institution always wins. Except that rule just got shattered. And the person who shattered it does not even have 5 years of professional experience yet. Her name is Caitlin Clark. And what has unfolded over the last 18 months inside the WNBA is not just a sports story. It is a full-scale power transfer. The kind that only happens once or twice in a generation. The kind where the old guard wakes up one morning and realizes with a cold, sinking feeling that they are no longer in charge. The kind where a commissioner, who thought she was running a league, suddenly finds herself running damage control for a situation she created herself. According to multiple reports, WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert is furious behind closed doors. Not frustrated, not concerned, furious. And when you trace back exactly how this moment arrived, it becomes clear that the explosion was not caused by one event. It was the result of a long series of miscalculations, political failures, and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge what was directly in front of her. The NBC deal simply lit the fuse on a powder keg that had been building for over a year. This is the story of how one player made herself bigger than the institution, and how the institution handed her the tools to do it. The first thing you need to understand is what the NBC deal actually represents, because the surface-level headline does not tell the full story. On paper, the WNBA secured a record-breaking 11-year media rights agreement worth over $2 billion. That number sounds extraordinary, and in the context of women's professional basketball, it genuinely is. Commissioner Engelbert could stand at a podium and call it a historic victory for the league. She could frame it as the culmination of decades of growth, of building something from nothing, of finally forcing the sports media world to take women's basketball seriously. But that framing starts to fall apart the moment you look at what NBC actually purchased. They did not pay $2 billion for the WNBA. They paid $2 billion for the Caitlin Clark experience. There is a significant difference between those two things, and everyone in the industry knows it. Reports circulating throughout the sports media world indicate that NBC's internal content strategy is built around Caitlin Clark-focused programming. The league's long-standing marketing approach, the one that emphasizes collective achievement, equal visibility, and the idea that every roster spot carries the same value, does not interest the network. It never did. What interests NBC is ratings. And the ratings data is not subtle. It points to one player, one jersey, one name. So NBC did what billion-dollar media companies do. They bought the rights, and then they made their priorities known. They didn't ask for permission. They did not negotiate around the commissioner's preferences. They looked at the numbers, determined where the audience was, and built their strategy accordingly. In doing so, they effectively bypassed Cathy Engelbert's authority over her own product. She cannot call NBC and demand that they shift focus to the New York Liberty. She cannot instruct them to balance their coverage across the roster. The moment that contract was signed, the network became the one setting the agenda. And the agenda has number 22 at the center of every frame. For a commissioner, who has spent years trying to position the WNBA as a collective enterprise, that is not a partnership. That is a hostile restructuring of everything she has worked to build. And the tension that has reportedly erupted behind closed doors is a direct result of her realizing far too late that she handed the keys to people who had no interest in preserving her vision. But here's where the story gets even more revealing. Because the NBC situation didn't happen in isolation. It happened alongside another moment that sent shock waves through the WNBA establishment. A moment that in some ways told the story even more clearly than any media contract could. Earlier this year, a new league called Unrivaled made its debut. Founded by Brianna Stewart and Alyssa Thomas, Unrivaled was designed to give elite WNBA players a high-profile, well-compensated option during the off-season. The concept had genuine backing, serious money behind it, and a roster of established names that gave it immediate credibility. But the league also had a very specific problem. In a sports landscape increasingly defined by star power and individual narratives, Unrivaled needed one name above all others to transform from a promising startup into a cultural moment. They went after Caitlin Clark with everything they had. The offer they reportedly extended was not a standard contract. It was the kind of package you put together when you were trying to recruit someone who has the power to make or break your entire venture. A salary reportedly exceeding $1 million. Equity in the league itself, significant performance incentives. By any conventional measure, it was the kind of deal you do not turn down. It was structured specifically to make refusal feel irrational. Caitlin Clark turned it down anyway. The ripple effect of that decision moved through the WNBA world like a shock wave. Because on the surface, declining millions of dollars and a chance to play alongside the sport's biggest names might look like arrogance. But read it more carefully, and a completely different picture emerges. By walking away from Unrivaled, Clark sent a message to every player, every executive, every media figure, and every sponsor paying attention. She does not need their platform. She does not need their money to validate her brand. She is building something entirely her own outside the existing structure. And she has enough leverage to do it without asking anyone's permission. For Cathy Engelbert, that rejection was not just an inconvenience. It was a declaration. Clark was telling the establishment that the table they were offering her a seat at was not the only table in the room. And that level of independence from a player who hasn't even completed 2 full professional seasons is exactly the kind of thing that keeps a commissioner awake at night. To fully understand why Engelbert's frustration has reportedly reached a boiling point, you have to go back further than the NBC deal. You have to go back to the moment when the commissioner had a chance to define her relationship with the most important player in the league's history and chose the wrong path. Throughout Caitlin Clark's rookie season, something uncomfortable played out on courts across the league. Physical play that went beyond the boundaries of competitive basketball. Targeted contact, flagrant fouls that drew immediate reactions from fans watching at home and in arenas. Moments that to a significant portion of the viewing public looked less like hard-nosed defense, and more like a coordinated effort to send a message to the new arrival. The commissioner's office watched it happen and stayed quiet. The silence was not accidental. Multiple reports at the time suggested that Engelbert was reluctant to come hard on veteran players, concerned that doing so would fracture her relationship with the established core of the league. She was trying to manage 2 audiences simultaneously. The new wave of fans who had discovered the WNBA through Clark and the players who had been there for years and resented the implication that one rookie was outshining everything they had built. So she said nothing. She let it play out. Then came the interview. When pushed directly about the hostile atmosphere surrounding Clark, the rough play, the tensions between fans and players, the general cloud of negativity that had settled over the league, Engelbert gave a response that became infamous almost immediately. She compared the situation to the Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird rivalry. She talked about how great competition generates tension, and how that tension drives viewership. She framed what many people saw as targeted hostility as a natural byproduct of healthy competition. The response was a disaster. Players from the WNBA pushed back. Caitlin Clark's fan base turned on Engelbert with full force. Sports media commentators, who had been following the story, called it tone-deaf at best and evasive at worst. The commissioner was forced into a public apology shortly afterward, but by that point, the credibility damage had already been done. She had shown the world and shown Caitlin Clark that the person nominally in charge of protecting the league's players would not stand up for its most visible star when it mattered most. That failure created a vacuum, and NBC walked right into it. There is one specific chapter in this story that does not get discussed as much as it should, but it may be the most consequential piece of the entire puzzle. Last summer, when the United States Olympic basketball team was assembled for the Paris Games, Caitlin Clark was left off the roster. The selection committee made the call. They cited basketball reasons. They talked about fit, about experience, about the depth of talent already available. On the surface, it was presented as a difficult, but defensible decision made by people who understand the game at the highest level. Cathy Engelbert publicly endorsed it. What happened next became one of the most discussed topics in women's sports. NBC, which held the broadcasting rights for the Olympics, was reportedly livid. Not just disappointed, livid. Because the people running numbers at NBC understood something that the selection committee either did not see or chose to ignore. Caitlin Clark's presence on that Olympic roster would have generated viewership records for women's basketball that might have stood for decades. The advertising revenue alone from a Clark-led Olympic run would have been staggering. By leaving her off the team, the establishment did not just make a basketball decision. They made a financial decision, and they made it the wrong way. The NBC deal that followed needs to be understood partly through that lens, because when a network spends billions of dollars on a league, and then watches that league's establishment actively avoid maximizing the value of its biggest star, the network does not forget. The intense focus on Clark that NBC has built into its Wnba coverage is not purely organic enthusiasm. There is an element of correction to it. A statement that says, "The old guard cost us money once. We will not allow it to happen again." The commissioner is now managing the consequences of a grudge held by a media partner with far more financial power than her office. While the institutional failures were piling up at the commissioner level, a different kind of battle was playing out in the public sphere. And it revealed just how exposed the WNBA establishment had become. For months, Hall of Famer Sheryl Swoopes used her platform to chip away at Caitlin Clark's credibility. She questioned the legitimacy of Clark's impact. She manipulated comparisons to make Clark's numbers look less impressive. On several occasions, she refused to say Clark's name directly on air, a choice so deliberate that audiences noticed immediately. The commentary was consistent, pointed, and personal in a way that went beyond normal sports analysis. Then, before a nationally televised game in which Swoopes was scheduled to work the broadcast booth, she was removed from the assignment. The message from network executives could not have been clearer if they had held a press conference. Sheryl Swoopes, a genuine legend of women's basketball, was sidelined because her commentary was considered a threat to the product. And the product, in the network's eyes, was Caitlin Clark. Diana Taurasi and others who spent months publicly dismissing Clark's influence on the league's growth watched the NBC contract arrive and found themselves facing a reckoning. The billions of dollars flowing into the WNBA were not flowing in because of what they built over the previous decade. They were flowing in because of one player who had been in the league for less than 2 seasons. For Cathy Engelbert, the Swoopes situation presented an impossible position. She has a responsibility to the league's legacy players. She has relationships with veterans who have carried the WNBA through years of financial difficulty and public indifference. But her media partners were now drawing hard lines around who could and could not take shots at the player driving their investment. She was being forced to choose between protecting the culture she inherited and satisfying the partners who were paying to take the league to the next level. There is no version of that choice where everyone leaves the table happy. Strip away the politics, the personalities, and the competing narratives, And what remains is a financial reality so stark that it makes every other element of this story secondary. For more than 25 years, the WNBA operated at a loss. The NBA provided subsidies that kept the league alive through seasons where the economics simply did not work. The women's game was worth protecting, worth developing, worth investing in. But it was not, by any honest financial measure, self-sustaining. That was the baseline. That was the reality that Cathy Engelbert and every commissioner before her had to manage. Then Caitlin Clark's rookie season happened. Arenas that had been half full for years sold out completely. Jersey sales did not tick upward. They exploded, with some reports indicating increases of over 500%. Television ratings hit numbers that the WNBA had never approached before. Charter flights, which players had been requesting for years on basic safety and professionalism grounds, were suddenly approved because the revenue existed to support them. The league went from a financial dependency to something resembling a functioning business in the span of a single season. And virtually every analyst tracking the numbers pointed to the same cause. The problem from Engelbert's perspective is that this new financial reality comes with an enormous vulnerability. The entire structure is built on one person's continued engagement, health, and presence. If Caitlin Clark suffers a serious injury, the projections collapse. If she decides she wants a season in Europe, the rating story falls apart. If she reaches a point of genuine dissatisfaction with how the league treats her and signals even a hint of that publicly, the NBC contract's audience assumptions become impossible to meet. That is an extraordinary amount of leverage for one player to hold. It fundamentally changes the nature of every conversation between Clark's representation and the league office. In a conventional labor negotiation, the employer holds the upper hand. The organization can set conditions, enforce rules, and manage player expectations from a position of structural authority. That dynamic no longer applies here. The player is the economy. The employer is managing around her rather than above her. Sponsors have noticed this shift as well. Companies like Nike, Wilson, and Gatorade are investing in the WNBA at record levels, but their marketing is centered almost entirely on Clark. Nike's deal with her reportedly exceeds her WNBA salary by a significant margin, which creates a fascinating and uncomfortable reality for the league. Clark's financial loyalty, to the extent that it can be directed, runs toward her sponsors before it runs toward the WNBA. If Nike's interests suggest she should skip a particular league event or prioritize a different commitment, the league has limited leverage to push back. Reports suggest that sponsors have been going directly to Clark's representation to negotiate opportunities, bypassing the commissioner's office entirely. That is not a minor procedural issue. That is the market telling the commissioner that she is no longer the essential intermediary she once was. There is one more dimension to this that the numbers alone cannot fully capture, and it has to do with the people in the seats and the people watching from home. The fans who arrived in the WNBA alongside Caitlin Clark are different from the league's traditional audience in one very specific way. They are loyal to Clark, not to the institution. The core WNBA fan base, passionate, long-tenured, deeply invested in the league's history and culture, has a relationship with the sport itself. They follow teams, follow players, follow storylines that span seasons and decades. The new wave of fans, the ones who have been dubbed the Clarkies, arrived through a single portal. They follow one person. The WNBA is the venue where that person plays, but it is not the object of their attachment. This distinction matters enormously for how Engelbert has to manage public relations. Every time she makes a decision that appears to work against Clark's interests, she is not just managing one player. She is managing the expectations of millions of fans who are watching to see whether the institution deserves to host their favorite athlete. And those fans are not quiet. Social media comment sections beneath WNBA content fill up with calls for Engelbert's resignation at a pace that reflects how strongly this audience has decided who the villain of this story is. The NBC deal from the perspective of these fans is not just a business announcement. It is confirmation. It tells them that the world's largest media companies agree with what they have been saying all along. That Clark is the star, that the league's value proposition is inseparable from her presence, and that anyone who has spent the past year trying to minimize her influence was wrong. That validation has made these fans louder, more confident, and more demanding than they were before. And Engelbert has to absorb that pressure while simultaneously managing a locker room full of veteran players who feel the exact opposite way. That balancing act is not just difficult, it may be genuinely impossible. The deeper story running beneath all of this is about what the league allowed to develop on the court and how that culture is now coming back to create problems that NBC's cameras are going to make impossible to ignore. The physical targeting of Clark during her rookie season, the silence from the league office, the framing of fan outrage as something poisonous rather than as a legitimate response to what people were watching. All of that created a narrative that worked barely in a world where the Wnba was a niche product with a limited broadcast footprint. It does not work in a world where NBC is bringing millions of casual sports fans to the games for the first time. The casual viewer who tunes in because they saw highlights on SportsCenter and wants to watch Caitlin Clark play does not have the context that longtime WNBA fans have built up over years. They see what is in front of them. And if what is in front of them is a player getting hit with a forearm to the face while the referee looks away, they are not going to read a think piece about competitive rivalries and basketball culture. They are going to talk about it. And in the NBC era, that conversation does not stay on basketball Twitter. It goes to the Today Show. It goes to the evening news. It goes to the mainstream sports media apparatus that has no particular reason to defend the league's preferred framing. Engelbert knows this, which means she is now in the uncomfortable position of needing to crack down on the exact behavior that she previously allowed to continue unchecked. The veterans who felt protected by the league's silence are going to find that protection evaporating. Not because the commissioner had a change of heart, but because the broadcast partner changed the stakes. That internal fracture between what the established players expected and what the new reality demands is going to define the locker room atmosphere heading into the next season. Looking at what the 2025 season brings, the picture gets even more complicated for the commissioner's office. The expansion is key. The league is expanding. The Golden State Valkyries are entering the picture. New markets, new money, new storylines. On the surface, that should be cause for celebration. Expansion is a sign of health. But expansion also means more moving pieces, more competing interests, and more opportunities for the power dynamic that has already been destabilized to shift even further. Rumors circulating within the league suggest that Caitlin Clark's camp is fully aware of the leverage they hold and may begin formalizing demands that reflect that leverage. Private travel arrangements, security protocols, scheduling considerations that protect her availability for national broadcasts, rest provisions that ensure she is at full capacity for the games NBC most wants to showcase. A year ago, those requests from a player with Clark's experience level would have been laughed out of a league office meeting. Today, the moment Clark's team signals dissatisfaction with any aspect of how the league is treating her, NBC executives are reportedly capable of picking up the phone and making the commissioner's life very difficult very quickly. That is what the power structure looks like now. The commissioner is no longer the authority in the room. She is the coordinator. She facilitates the relationship between the player, who generates the value, and the corporations that monetize it. Her office sets rules, manages logistics and maintains the institutional framework, but the actual leverage belongs to other parties. The title of commissioner remains. The authority the title used to carry has quietly moved elsewhere. There was a moment not that long ago where a different choice was possible. where the commissioner could have recognized what Caitlin Clark represented, not just for ratings and revenue, but for the league's entire future, and made a deliberate public decision to be on the right side of that history. To defend her when it was uncomfortable, to stand up to the veterans when the physical targeting became impossible to justify, to look at the Olympic roster situation, and think about the long-term cost of exclusion rather than the short-term political benefit of going along with the committee. That choice was not made, and the explosion we are now hearing about behind closed doors is the sound of someone coming to terms with what that cost. Here is where everything lands. The NBC announcement was not just a television deal. It was the final piece of a restructuring that had been building for over a year. Commissioner Cathy Engelbert reportedly finds herself furious and outmaneuvered, not because the market moved against her, but because she refused to read where the market was going until it was too late to position herself on the right side of it. Caitlin Clark did not overthrow the WNBA establishment through conflict. She did it through performance, through commercial dominance, through the kind of market validation that no political structure inside a league can override. She turned down the unrivaled league's millions and told the establishment she did not need their platform. She became the reason the world's largest networks are paying billions to broadcast a league that spent 25 years surviving on subsidies. She survived a season of targeted physical play, institutional silence, and establishment gatekeeping, and came out the other side with more power than when she started. The veterans who spent months insisting that reality was coming for her were not wrong. Reality did arrive. It just did not arrive the way they expected. It arrived in the form of a network contract that made their careers the supporting storyline in someone else's highlight reel. The WNBA is not a charity project anymore. It is a business, a real one with real money, real corporate partners, and real consequences for making the wrong decisions. And in business, when one person represents the overwhelming majority of your commercial value, you do not fight that person. You do not try to manage them back into a structure that no longer reflects reality. You build around them, or you get left behind. Cathy Engelbert is now managing a league she no longer fully controls, a locker room that is divided along lines she helped create, and a media relationship that has effectively made her accountability run upward to corporate partners rather than downward to the players and teams she nominally oversees. The revolution did not announce itself. It did not come with protests, or ultimatums, or dramatic confrontations in league offices. It came with a broadcast contract. It came with a turned-down unrivaled offer. It came with empty arenas that suddenly filled up and jersey sales that shattered every record the league had on the books. The last question hanging over all of this is whether Cathy Engelbert can find a way to adapt to an environment she did not build and did not predict, or whether the Caitlin Clark era will ultimately claim her position as its most prominent institutional casualty. The signs at this moment do not point toward adaptation, but this is not the end of the power struggle. Word is already circulating that the Women's National Basketball Association may be preparing to step into this equation in a significant way. What that looks like, what it means for Clark, for the veterans, and for the future of the league, that is a story still unfolding. And when it does, you will not want to miss.